The gunshots that tore through Blackwood Manor shattered the silence of the night like thunder. Red emergency lights flickered in frantic rhythm as smoke grenades filled the hallways, and the FBI SWAT team flooded in like a storm. Weapons aimed directly at Marcus Blackwood. The Mafia boss clutched his 6-year-old son Theo tight against his chest, backing against the cold steel wall of the panic room, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might stop. For a man who had stared down death 100 times, who had built an empire on blood and fear, this was the first moment he felt truly helpless. Then she stepped forward. Serena Cole, the night shift cleaning lady, the invisible woman who had mopped his floors for 8 months without him ever learning her name, moved in one fluid motion and spread her arms to shield the father and son. She said only 4 words. The SWAT commander froze. He moved closer, examined her face carefully beneath the dim red light, then stood at attention and saluted her like saluting a general. Marcus Blackwood, the most powerful and ruthless man on the East Coast, watched in complete disbelief. That salute would shatter everything he thought he knew about the small, quiet woman who cleaned his mansion. But to understand how they arrived at that moment, you have to go back 6 hours earlier, when Serena Cole was just another invisible ghost doing a job nobody noticed, carrying secrets darker than anything Marcus Blackwood had ever buried. If this story satisfies you, give it a like. If it moves you, share it with your friends. And if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, the most powerful heroes are the ones we never see coming. 6 hours before everything happened, Serena Cole was standing in a cramped one-room apartment in the eastern slums of the city. The damp walls were stained with spreading black watermarks. A window that wouldn't close all the way let cold air slip through the cracks. The faint rustling of rats inside the walls had become a familiar sound each night, because this apartment was all she could afford after paying for her mother's medicine and her daughter's schooling. Serena stood before the small mirror in the corner, wearing a gray janitor's uniform with frayed shoulders. She tied her hair neatly and hid the faint scar that ran along her neck, a remnant of another life she tried to bury. On the narrow bed pushed against the wall, her daughter Lily, 6 years old, slept deeply, a child with eyes exactly like her mother's, always watching before speaking, older than her age because she had grown up in scarcity. Serena bent down to kiss her forehead and breathe in the soft scent of her hair, because this was the only moment in the day that made her feel human. On the next bed, her mother, Margaret Cole, 58 years old, breathed in a wheezing, restless sleep as terminal lung cancer slowly consumed her body. Bottles of medicine lined the bedside table, each one costing a week of Serena's wages. She checked the oxygen tank to make sure everything was stable, then left a little money on the table for breakfast the next morning. $17. That was all that remained in her wallet until the next payday. Serena put on her old coat and slipped out the door in silence because she didn't want to wake anyone, and she was used to disappearing like a ghost. On the empty night bus, she stared out the window as streetlights slid past like blurred streaks of light. As every night, the memories returned beyond her control. She saw herself 4 years earlier in black tactical gear crawling across a Syrian desert field under moonlight. She had been Captain Serena Cole of the CIA Special Activities Center, one of the finest female operatives ever trained. She had completed more than 30 hostage rescue missions in the most dangerous war zones with a near-perfect success rate. Then that night in Syria, everything collapsed. Her husband Nathan, her teammate in the same unit, was betrayed by a mole inside the CIA. They were ambushed. Nathan was shot 3 times in the chest, right in front of her eyes. She held him in her arms as his blood soaked into the desert sand while he whispered his last words, telling her to protect Lily and promise him. She promised, and she kept that promise at any cost. The tragedy didn't end there. The traitor abducted Lily, who was only 2 at the time, to erase loose ends. Serena, with a still unhealed wound on her neck, hunted for her daughter alone for 48 hours without sleep. She found Lily in an abandoned warehouse outside Washington, guarded by 4 kidnappers. She killed all 4 with her bare hands in less than 3 minutes. When she ran out holding Lily, the child didn't cry and only clung to her mother's neck and whispered that she was scared. After that, the CIA didn't reward her. They froze her, because she knew too many secrets and knew exactly who the traitor was. They took everything from her: her apartment, her accounts, her identity. They turned her into no one, a ghost with a small child and blood-soaked memories. Serena returned to her mother, the only person she had left, only to find her gravely ill. She worked 3 jobs to survive. She served at a cafe during the day. She did laundry work on weekends. She mopped floors at night at Blackwood Manor, the residence of the most notorious mafia boss on the East Coast. She didn't care who Marcus Blackwood was or what he did. She only needed her wages on time to buy her mother's medicine. She only needed to survive one day at a time until Lily was old enough to take care of herself. The bus stopped at the final stop. Serena stepped off and walked toward the grand mansion on the hill where she had worked for 8 months. No one knew her name. No one looked at her for more than 3 seconds. That was exactly what she wanted, because the invisible were never found, and the secrets she carried would be buried forever, or at least that was what she thought. At the same moment, Serena stepped through the servants' back gate. Marcus Blackwood was sitting in the underground meeting room beneath the mansion's basement, a room with no windows, half-meter-thick concrete walls, completely soundproofed from the outside world, a place where bloody decisions were made, and human fates were decided with nothing more than a single nod. And Marcus sat at the head of the table, his face cold as if carved from stone, 37 years old, but with eyes far older, carrying the darkness of countless sleepless nights and choices no ordinary person could imagine. And around the table were 5 men, his closest lieutenants in the Blackwood Empire, and kneeling in the middle of the room with his hands tied behind his back was a trembling middle-aged man, Marco Santini, once Marcus's largest casino manager, who had been discovered passing information to a rival family for the past 6 months. And Marcus didn't shout or threaten and only looked at Marco with an empty gaze as if looking at a broken object, and his voice was low and slow, every word carrying the weight of a death sentence, as he said that he had treated Marco like a brother, that he had paid for his son's education and covered his wife's hospital bills, and that this was how Marco repaid him. And Marco begged and cried with tears and mucus running down his face as he spoke of pressure and threats from the Moretti family and having no choice. And Marcus listened in silence, and when Marco finished, Marcus stood up, walked toward the traitor, drew his handgun from his belt, and told him that there was always a choice, and that he had chosen wrong, and a single shot rang out, dry and final. And Marco Santini collapsed onto the floor, and Marcus returned to the table and set the gun down as if he had just completed a dull administrative task, and told them to clean it up and send flowers to the funeral, and that Marco's wife wasn't guilty, and that was all, and no one in the room dared to meet his eyes. And the meeting ended 10 minutes later, and Marcus left the basement and took his private elevator up to the 3rd floor, where his son's bedroom was, at the end of the hall. And when the door to Theo's room opened, a completely different man appeared. And Theo Blackwood, 6 years old, was sitting on the floor among half-built Lego sets, with black hair like his father's but large brown eyes from his mother, eyes that no longer held the innocence of childhood, because since witnessing his mother being shot dead in front of him 2 years earlier, Theo barely spoke to anyone but his father and feared the dark and loud noises and strangers, and only slept at night with the light on, and his father beside him. And when Theo looked up and said "Dad," a small smile crossed his face for the first time that day, and Marcus knelt down beside his son among the toys, and removed his expensive suit jacket, and rolled up his shirt sleeves, and began building Lego with Theo, as if he hadn't just killed a man moments earlier. And the contrast between those 2 images could make anyone who witnessed it shudder, because the same hand that had pulled a trigger was now gently placing colorful plastic bricks, according to the instructions of a 6-year-old child, and the same voice that had pronounced a death sentence was now softly praising the tower his son was building. And Theo asked if his father was busy that day, and Marcus brushed his hair and said he had a little work, but would stay until Theo fell asleep, and asked which story he wanted tonight. And Theo said he wanted the one his mother used to tell. And Marcus's heart felt as if it were being crushed because it had been 2 years, and every time Theo mentioned his mother it felt like someone was driving a knife into his chest, because Isabella, his wife and the only love of his life, had been assassinated by the Moretti family right in front of the school gates while she was picking up Theo. 3 shots, 2 to the chest and 1 to the head, and she died instantly, collapsing on the sidewalk in her white dress soaked red with blood, while Theo stood less than 2 meters away and saw everything. And Marcus arrived when the police had already sealed off the scene and had to shove 3 men aside to reach his wife. But it was too late, and he held Isabella's body for 20 minutes without crying or speaking, and only sat there in deadly silence. And that night, after Theo was soothed to sleep by the nanny, Marcus Blackwood summoned all his forces, and within 48 hours, 12 senior members of the Moretti family were eliminated, and the man who shot Isabella was found in an abandoned warehouse with his body no longer intact. But revenge didn't bring Isabella back, and didn't erase the terror in Theo's eyes each night, and didn't fill the emptiness in Marcus's heart. And from that day on, he swore he would protect Theo at any cost, and turned Blackwood Manor into a fortress with the most advanced security systems and guards 24 hours a day, and a bomb-proof safe room in the basement, and secret escape tunnels, and no one was allowed near Theo without his permission. And Marcus read to his son until the boy fell asleep, still holding his father's hand, and then sat beside his bed for another 10 minutes, watching his peaceful, sleeping face. And in that moment, he wasn't a mafia boss or a killer, and he was only a lonely father who loved his son enough to burn the entire world if anyone dared touch him. And he didn't know that in only a few hours, his vow to protect his son would be tested to its limit, and that the one who would save Theo's life wouldn't be his elite guards or million-dollar security systems, but a nameless woman, quietly mopping the floor downstairs, whom he had never once bothered to look at twice. Serena began her shift at 7 in the evening. Like every night for the past 8 months, she took the cleaning cart from the basement storage room and checked the mop, the bucket, the cloths, and the bottle of cleaning solution. Her schedule was always fixed, with the second floor first, then the third floor, and finally the side corridors. She never went into the first floor area where Marcus and his associates usually held their meetings. Not because anyone told her to avoid it, but because she knew the boundaries of the invisible, and the less she appeared, the less trouble followed. She pushed the cart along the second floor corridor, while her eyes habitually scanned every corner. Not out of curiosity, but out of a survival instinct carved into her bones after more than 10 years as an operative. She counted the guards on patrol: 4 on the first floor, 2 on the second floor, 2 on the third floor guarding the boy Theo's room. Fewer than usual, because normally there were at least 10 at night. She noted it without dwelling on it. Maybe shifts had changed. Maybe there was an event she didn't know about. It wasn't her business. But when Serena reached the emergency exit door on the third floor, she stopped. The lock had been changed. She recognized it instantly after passing that door hundreds of times over 8 months. The old, dull silver lock had scratches on the right corner, from a jammed spare key. This new one was bright silver, flawless, and a completely different brand. She looked around. There was no maintenance notice. There was no replacement order on the technical team's log she had happened to read while cleaning the equipment room the previous week. Someone had changed the lock outside official procedure. She continued her work, but her senses had already gone on alert. 15 minutes later, while she was mopping the corridor near the control room, she glanced through the glass door at the surveillance monitor. Something was wrong. She was used to the rhythm of the mansion's camera system. Each camera shifted angle every 15 seconds. The timestamp always matched the wall clock. But tonight, the third-floor corridor camera lagged 3 seconds behind real time. No ordinary person would ever notice. But Serena wasn't ordinary. She had been trained to catch details others missed. A 3-second delay meant someone had interfered with the system, maybe to insert a looped image, maybe to create a window for some hidden action. She felt a chill run down her spine. Her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She kept mopping, but every sense was taut as a wire. Then she saw him. A man in a maintenance uniform stepped out of a side stairwell. His employee badge read Ryan Torres from the maintenance team. But Serena knew every night shift worker's face. After 8 months, she had memorized them all. This man wasn't one of them. More importantly, the way he moved wasn't like a technician. His steps were too steady. His shoulders were too square. His center of gravity was too low. His eyes swept the corridor in a pattern of military training. The toolbox he carried was heavier than normal, as if it held more than wrenches and screwdrivers. Serena lowered her head and pretended to focus on mopping. She let the man pass without looking up. He didn't even notice the small cleaning woman kneeling on the floor. To him, she was invisible. And that was his greatest mistake. When his shadow vanished around the corner, Serena stood up and watched the direction he had gone. It led to the stairs up to the third floor, where Theo's bedroom was at the end of the hall. With the changed lock, the tampered cameras, the stranger inside, and fewer guards than usual, Serena didn't believe in coincidence. In the world she came from, there was no coincidence. There was only planning and execution. Someone was preparing something big tonight. The target was very likely the Blackwood family. She needed to warn someone. But who would ever believe a cleaning woman? Serena made her decision within seconds. She couldn't stay silent knowing that something was wrong. Even if she was only a cleaning woman, and even if no one would believe her, she still had to try, because her conscience wouldn't allow her to look away when a 6-year-old child might be in danger. And she found Julian Vance in the first-floor security room, a 40-year-old former SEAL, and the head of Marcus Blackwood's security team. A large man with cold, sharp eyes and the arrogance of someone who believed he had seen everything. And Serena knocked lightly and spoke in the humble, soft voice she used with everyone in the mansion, as she said that she had something to report. And Julian looked up from the surveillance screens as if she were a fly that had wandered into the room and asked who she was. And she said, "Serena, the night cleaner." And Julian sighed with irritation and told her to be quick. And she told him about the changed lock on the third-floor emergency exit, and the 3-second delay on the third-floor corridor camera. and the strange man in the building with a badge reading Ryan Torres, whom she didn't recognize. And Julian stared at her for a few seconds before laughing with a mocking, dismissive sound and asking what a cleaner knew about locks and cameras and staff. And she said she had worked there 8 months and knew every face, and that the man wasn't from maintenance. And Julian stood and stepped toward her with cold eyes and told her that she cleaned floors and security was his job and that he didn't need a cleaner to teach him how to work and that the system here was the most advanced and no one could get in without him knowing. And when she tried to say she only wanted to help, he cut her off and asked what she wanted and accused her of wasting his time and seeking attention and told her to go back to her work and warned that if he saw her wandering where she didn't belong again, he would fire her immediately. And Serena lowered her head and said nothing more and turned and left the security room with light steps, as if the insult hadn't touched her. And inside, she wasn't angry because she was used to being dismissed, and she wasn't disappointed because she had expected this reaction, and the only thing she felt was certainty that she was right, and if Julian Vance wouldn't believe her, she would prepare herself. And Serena returned to the basement maintenance room where tools and technical documents were kept, and she knew the file cabinet code because she had seen a technician enter it the week before while she was cleaning nearby. 4 digits, 2019, and she opened the cabinet and took out the detailed floor plans of Blackwood Manor, with 3 main floors and 1 basement, and the ventilation system and the technical pipes, and the main stair and the side stairs and the emergency stairs, and the bomb-proof safe room in the basement, and Serena spread the map on the floor and scanned every detail with the speed and precision of someone who had studied hundreds of mission maps in her life, and marked all exits in her mind with the main stairs and 2 side stairs, and 4 emergency exits, and the ventilation ducts wide enough for an adult and a child and the secret tunnel from the basement into the woods behind the mansion, because, if something happened, she needed to know how to get someone out, not because it was her duty or because she was paid to do it, but because on the 3rd floor there was a 6-year-old child sleeping, a child without a mother like Lily had once been without a father. And Serena folded the map and put it back and erased all traces, and returned to her cleaning cart and continued mopping as if nothing had happened. Because hope was the strategy of fools, and preparation was what kept people alive, and Serena Cole always prepared for the worst. While Serena was quietly preparing for the worst, Victor Crane was sitting in his private office in the east wing of the mansion, the door locked tightly from the inside, a perfectly soundproof room that Marcus had granted his most trusted financial advisor for the past 15 years, never knowing that this blind trust would be the knife in his back tonight. And Victor, 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair and the calm face of a man accustomed to numbers and balance sheets, had spent 15 years playing the loyal brother, the irreplaceable right hand of Marcus Blackwood, managing the Empire's cash flow, laundering money through shell companies, hiding assets from the FBI, earning Marcus's trust more than anyone else, even gaining access to Theo when necessary, a fatal mistake, and Victor opened the hidden drawer beneath his desk and took out the encrypted phone no one in the mansion even knew existed, and dialed the number he knew by heart, and after 3 rings, a rough male voice answered and identified himself as Kane Mitchell, and asked if everything was ready. And Kane spoke with the cold tone of a man who had killed more people than there were days in a year, and said his team was in position with 4 men on the 3rd floor and 1 in the control room to neutralize the system, and that the emergency exit lock had been replaced, and the cameras had been tampered with. And Victor nodded even though Kane couldn't see him, and said good, and that the meeting with the Chicago and Miami partners would start at 9:30, and Marcus would be on the 1st floor for at least 2 hours, which was their window. And when Kane asked about the 3rd floor guards, Victor smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said Ingrid would handle it, and that she would bring coffee laced with sleeping drugs to the guards at 9 and 15 minutes. Later, they wouldn't be awake to protect anyone. And after a pause, Kane asked about the boy, and Victor answered without hesitation that the child was to be taken alive, as the only leverage to force Marcus to sign the transfer papers, and that after everything was done, both father and son were to be killed with no witnesses left. And Kane asked if the money would be transferred as agreed, and Victor said $5 million when the boy was in their hands, and the other $5 million when Marcus signed, and both disappeared forever. And Victor ended the call and looked out the window at the city lights flickering in the night, because he had waited 10 years for this moment. Ever since his younger brother Daniel Crane, 23 years old, an ordinary dock worker who only needed money for college, had been killed during one of Marcus's raids on a warehouse Daniel didn't even know belonged to Blackwood, a fast and bloody operation with no survivors, including Daniel, something Marcus never knew and no one reported, just another routine cleanup for him. But the day Victor's only brother died in fire and bullets, and Victor had learned the truth 6 months later, and chosen not to leave with his pain, but to stay and wait for revenge. 10 years of pretending loyalty, 10 years of swallowing his tears every time Marcus called him brother, 10 years of secretly building ties with the Moretti family and feeding them information and preparing for tonight. When Marcus would lose everything, his empire, his wealth, and most of all the son he loved more than his own life. Eye for eye, son for son, and Victor stood up and adjusted his tie in the mirror, because he had to go downstairs and play the loyal advisor long enough for Kane to finish the job. And before leaving, he texted Ingrid Vale, Marcus's secretary and his secret lover of 3 years. Only one short message telling her 9 o'clock, and don't forget the coffee. And she replied immediately that everything was ready and the dose was enough for the whole team, and in 15 minutes they'd be sleeping like the dead. And Victor smiled because Ingrid didn't know the full plan and thought it was only a corporate takeover and that she and Victor would vanish together with millions. And she didn't know the plan included killing a 6-year-old child. And she also didn't know Victor had no intention of taking her with him, and that she would be the perfect scapegoat when everything was over. And Victor left the room with his calm mask back in place and went down to the first floor, where Marcus was waiting to start the most important meeting of the year, and he would sit beside him, as he had for 15 years, and smile and nod and give sound financial advice. And when the shots rang out from the 3rd floor, he would be the first to point a gun at Marcus Blackwood's head. And the clock struck 8:45 with 45 minutes left before the play began, and no one in the grand mansion knew the storm was coming. No one except the silent figure on the 2nd floor, her eyes constantly watching, her heart silently counting down. At 9:30 in the evening, the meeting began exactly on schedule, and the 1st floor conference room of Blackwood Manor was designed to impress with an 8-meter-long oak table, a crystal chandelier worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and original oil paintings by master artists on the walls. A place where Marcus Blackwood received his most important partners, and where deals worth hundreds of millions were sealed with a handshake and a promise. And that night Marcus sat at the head of the table facing 2 guests from Chicago and Miami. Anthony Russo, the 60-year-old head of operations in Chicago with white silver hair and the eyes of a cunning fox, and beside him Diego Fernandez, the boss who controlled Miami, younger but no less dangerous. And they had come to discuss a new alliance, a deal that would merge 3 empires into a single network controlling the entire East Coast. With $500 million on the table, and Victor Crane sat to Marcus's right as the financial advisor he had been for 15 years, presenting figures, analyzing profits, offering persuasive forecasts with a calm professional voice that gave no hint he was counting down to betrayal. And Marcus listened and nodded, or asked sharp questions, but he wasn't fully focused because part of his mind was on the 3rd floor where Theo was sleeping, and he had checked the camera in his son's room before coming down and saw the boy lying quietly under the blanket, with the nightlight glowing softly, and 2 guards standing outside the door. Everything seeming normal, not knowing the image had been replaced with a loop from 30 minutes earlier. And at the same time, Ingrid Vale climbed the stairs with a tray of hot coffee, 32 years old with brown hair neatly tied, and the professional face of a perfect personal secretary who had earned absolute trust over 5 years. And no one questioned her when she brought coffee to the night guards, a gesture of care she sometimes made, and the 2 guards outside Theo's room accepted the coffee with brief thanks, unaware that each cup contained a strong sleeping drug enough to knock out a grown man within 15 minutes. And Ingrid smiled and wished them a smooth shift, and walked away, and went down to the 2nd and 1st floors with coffee for the remaining guards. The same formula, the same smile, the same wish, and 15 minutes later all 4 guards began to feel dizzy and blamed the night shift fatigue, until one by one they sat down with heavy eyelids and their heads dropping to their chests. And within 20 minutes, the 2nd and 3rd floors were left unguarded, and at 9:55, the lights throughout the mansion began to flicker, and in the 1st floor meeting room, Marcus looked up with a frown at the chandelier, blinking unevenly, and Anthony Russo paused, and Diego Fernandez reached, instinctively for his belt, and Victor kept his calm while counting, down inside and said it was a power issue and the backup system would activate in seconds. But it wasn't a power issue. It was the signal. And in the basement control room, one of Kane's men had taken over the mansion's power and security systems and activated the emergency protocol Marcus had set to protect the building during an attack. Only tonight it was used to turn the mansion into a trap, and the sound of grinding metal echoed through the building as fireproof steel doors descended from the ceiling, blocking main corridors, and the elevators stopped, and the main entrance was electronically locked, and red alarm lights replaced, the normal glow bathing everything in a blood-colored light. And Marcus jumped to his feet, as his battle-hardened instincts screamed that something was wrong, and he called for Julian, but there was no answer because the internal line was cut. And on the third floor, Kane, Mitchell, and 4 gunmen emerged from the emergency exit. Victor had unlocked and moved fast and silent like ghosts, with assault rifles and masked faces, and saw the 2 guards slumped unconscious outside Theo's room and signaled his men forward, and one kicked the door open. And Theo woke with wide brown eyes in terror as dark figures rushed into his room, and he screamed for his father. But a rough hand clamped over his mouth, and Kane stepped forward with cold eyes and hand, told the child to be quiet and do as he was told, and he would live. But one guard wasn't fully unconscious and tried to reach for his sidearm, and Kane turned and shot him in the chest without hesitation, and the gunshot rang through the 3rd floor, tearing the night apart. And on the 1st floor, Marcus heard the shot and felt his heart seize and thought of Theo, and turned to run for the stairs. But Victor was faster, and pressed a cold gun barrel to the back of Marcus's neck, and told him not to move and that the game was over. And Marcus froze, not because he feared death, but because the sound from the 3rd floor where his son slept froze his blood. And on the 2nd floor, Serena heard everything: the gunshot, the child's scream, the slam of steel doors, and she knew the moment she had prepared for had finally arrived. Serena froze in the middle of the 2nd floor corridor with the mop still in her hand, and in a split second her trained mind analyzed the situation. One shot, not a burst, meaning not a firefight but an execution or a warning. The child's scream just before it, meaning the target was the boy, Theo. The steel doors already down and the power controlled, meaning this was an organized internal attack. And her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to find an exit, to live and go back to Lily, because that was the logical choice, and she owed nothing to the Blackwood family, and she was only a cleaner, paid $8 an hour to mop floors. And Marcus Blackwood was a mafia boss, with blood on his hands, and his son, though innocent, wasn't her responsibility. But the image of Theo rose in her mind. The shy 6-year-old who often sat alone, drawing. The child without a mother like Lily had once been without a father. The child with wide brown eyes that had watched his mother die, and might now be watching hell again. And Serena closed her eyes for 1 second, and saw Lily in her mind, her own daughter, also 6 years old, sleeping in a broken apartment on the other side of the city. And she asked herself how she would feel if Lily were in danger, and someone who could save her chose to run instead. And when Serena opened her eyes, the decision had already been made, and she couldn't leave. Not for Marcus Blackwood, and not for money or duty, but because she was a mother, and on the 3rd floor there was a child who needed to be saved. And she dropped the mop to the floor with a decisive motion, as if discarding a part of her life, and slipped out of the gray cleaner's jacket to reveal a tight black shirt beneath. And her body wasn't the body of an ordinary working woman, but the body of a warrior with hard muscle and defined tendons under the skin. Because 8 months of cleaning hadn't erased 10 years of hellish training. And she drew the folding knife from her waistband, the only weapon she always carried by reflex, with a blade 10 centimeters long, sharp as a razor, and fast enough to sever a carotid artery in less than a second. And she checked it and folded it and slid it into her back pocket, and she tied her hair up high and neat so nothing could be grabbed or block her vision, and she slipped off her soft-soled work shoes and stood barefoot on the cold floor, because bare feet moved more silently than any shoes. And in that moment Serena Cole vanished, and the mask of the timid worker fell away entirely, revealing Captain Serena Cole of the SAC, the woman who had infiltrated the most heavily guarded fortresses in the world, who had pulled hostages from the hands of brutal terrorists, who had killed more people than she could count, and still lived to remember. And she moved toward the technical room, with footsteps silent as a ghost, knowing the main stairs were blocked, and the side stairs would be guarded. But there was another way, because the ventilation system of Blackwood Manor ran from the basement to the roof with branches on every floor, wide enough for an adult to crawl through. On her way to the technical room, she passed the open door of the security center. Inside, Julian Vance lay slumped over the console, a single bullet hole in his temple. The arrogant man who claimed no one could enter without him knowing hadn't even seen his killer coming. Serena didn't pause. She had warned him, and now he was just another ghost in the house. Serena reached the auxiliary service room at the end of the corridor where a large vent was covered by a metal grill, and she used her knife to remove the 4 screws in silence, and laid the grill gently on the floor without a sound, and slipped into the duct with her body bending like a snake, and inside it was dark and tight, and smelled of dust and metal, and she crawled forward with elbows and knees moving in a trained pattern to minimize noise, while counting distance in her mind against the map she had memorized. Left after 6 meters, right after 8, then straight for 12 more to reach the branch to the 3rd floor, and her heart beat steady, and her breathing stayed shallow and slow, with no panic and no fear, and only the absolute focus of someone who had walked through hell and returned. And in the darkness, she didn't think about what waited ahead, or about the possibility of dying tonight, and leaving Lily an orphan of both parents. and she thought only of the 6-year-old child being held somewhere on the 3rd floor, who might be crying and calling for his father in terror. And she would reach him, and she would get him out no matter the cost. And after 10 minutes, she saw the dull red glow through a grill ahead and knew she was at the 3rd floor. And she stopped and pressed her ear to the metal and listened to heavy footsteps and radio chatter. At least 2 men in the corridor and maybe more in the rooms. And Serena drew her knife and felt the cold steel settle into her palm and took one slow breath in and out, because this was the moment she returned to who she really was. And this was the moment when the hunter became a nightmare. Serena gently pushed the ventilation grill open just enough to observe the 3rd floor corridor. The red alarm light washed everything in a sickening blood-colored glow. She saw a gunman standing about 5 meters away with his back to her, a rifle in his hands and his eyes fixed toward the main stairwell. He was guarding that direction, and unaware that the real threat was coming from behind him, from inside the wall. Serena removed the grill completely and placed it silently inside the duct. She slipped out like a panther, her bare feet touching the cold tile floor. She rose in absolute silence, her body low, and her center of gravity dropped, and moved toward the gunman with steps that made no sound. The distance shrank. 4 meters. 3, 2. The gunman stayed unaware, listening to radio chatter and scanning forward, never hearing the ghost behind him. When she was less than a meter away, Serena struck. One arm clamped around his neck from behind, crushing his airway. The other locked his head to prevent any sound. It was a rear choke she had used dozens of times on infiltration missions. No noise, no blood, no trace. The man struggled for a few seconds, reaching for his weapon, but Serena held him like a steel vice and counted in her head. 7 seconds for oxygen deprivation, 12 for unconsciousness, 15 to make sure he wouldn't wake for at least 10 minutes. Exactly 15 seconds later, his body went limp. Serena lowered him gently to the floor and took the pistol from his belt. She checked the magazine. 12 rounds. Enough. She moved down the corridor toward Theo's room, past the dead guard whose blood was still spreading across the white tiles. She didn't stop. There was no time for grief. Only time for action. Theo's door was open. Serena pressed against the wall and looked inside. She saw Kane Mitchell in the center of the room, one hand gripping Theo's collar, the other holding a pistol. The child was crying soundlessly, tears running down his pale face. Beside Kane, another gunman spoke into a radio, saying the target was secured and waiting for orders. Serena calculated fast. 2 targets, 1 hostage. She had 1 gun and 1 knife. Shooting Kane risked Theo's life. She stepped into the room with her gun raised and fired once into the gunman's forehead. He collapsed before understanding what had happened. Kane spun like a trapped animal. He yanked Theo up and used the small body as a shield, pressing the gun to the child's temple. He shouted for Serena to drop the weapon or the boy would die. Serena stood still. There was no clear shot. She slowly lowered the gun to the floor and raised her hands. She told him not to hurt the child. Kane stared at her with suspicion. He asked who she was and how she killed his man. Serena didn't answer. She walked forward slowly, her hands still raised. Kane screamed at her to stop. He pressed the gun harder to Theo's head. The child cried out in pain and terror. Serena stopped 3 meters away. She looked straight into Kane's eyes. She told him coldly that he wouldn't shoot, because the boy was his only leverage, and killing him meant losing everything, and that the man on the floor had been his only outside contact, and now he was isolated. Kane blinked. A split second of distraction. That was all Serena needed. Her right hand flashed to her back pocket. She threw the folding knife at Kane's right shoulder, the gun hand. The blade pierced through muscle into bone. Kane screamed and dropped the gun. Serena lunged forward, kicked the weapon away, pulled Theo free, and placed herself between the child and the attacker. Kane, despite the injury, charged at her with a combat knife in his left hand. Serena didn't retreat. She caught his wrist mid-air, twisting it violently against the joint until a sickening snap echoed through the room. Kane screamed as the bone broke, dropping the knife. Before he could recover, she drove her elbow into his face. She kicked his knee and dropped him. She punched his throat and cut his air. Then she slipped behind him and locked her arm around his neck. She held until 15 seconds later, Kane Mitchell collapsed unconscious onto the floor. Serena stepped over his limp body, gripped the handle of her knife protruding from his shoulder, and pulled it free with a fluid motion. She wiped the blade on his shirt and slid it back into her pocket. Never leave a weapon behind. Serena stood breathing hard, adrenaline shaking her body. She turned and saw Theo curled in the corner, trembling, wide, terrified eyes staring at her. She knelt to his level and spoke gently. She told him he was safe. The boy clung to her like a lifeline. She whispered that they were going to play a game called the Quiet Game, and that he had to stay silent no matter what. He nodded, trying not to cry. She wiped his tears and told him he was brave and asked if he trusted her. He nodded again. Serena lifted him into her arms, took the gun, and checked the corridor. She knew there were still at least 2 gunmen somewhere in the mansion. She had to get Theo out before they realized their men were down. Serena carried Theo into the corridor and swept her eyes quickly in both directions. The main stairs to the left were already sealed by a steel door that had dropped from the ceiling. The side stairs to the right echoed with approaching footsteps. Surely Kane's partners coming to check when they couldn't reach him. She had only seconds to decide. Facing whoever was coming wasn't wise with a child in her arms. The emergency exit was locked, and she had no key. The elevators were dead. Every ordinary route was blocked. But Serena didn't take ordinary routes. She turned back to the ventilation opening she had used before, where the grill was still inside the duct. She set Theo down and knelt to his level and spoke fast and soft. They would go this way. It would be dark and tight, but he shouldn't be afraid. He had to crawl after her, and not speak, and not cry, no matter what. Remember the quiet game. Theo nodded, eyes wet but no longer crying, trying to be brave. Serena climbed into the duct first and pulled Theo in after her. She replaced the grill from the inside to hide the opening. In the dark metal tunnel, she could only see Theo's round eyes reflecting the faint red light from outside. She squeezed his hand gently and told him to follow slowly and quietly. They began to move, Serena in front and Theo right behind her, clutching her leg as if afraid to be lost in the dark. The duct was narrow, and the air was thick with dust and metal. Every movement had to be careful not to echo. Outside, she heard angry shouting, running footsteps, doors being kicked, curses. Someone had discovered Kane and the others were down. They were searching for her and Theo without knowing where to look. Serena kept crawling, counting distance in her head from the map she had memorized. Right turn, then straight, then left, then down. She was leading Theo toward the main duct that went to the basement where the bomb-proof safe room was. After about 10 minutes, they reached the first obstacle. An old metal grid bolted into the concrete blocked the branch from the 3rd floor to the main duct. It was a security measure Marcus had installed to prevent intruders through the vents, but he hadn't imagined someone might need to escape through them. Serena felt the thick bars with her hands. They were too close to crawl through. She had no cutting tools, only her hands. She whispered to Theo to wait and not be afraid because she would open the way. She gripped the bars, testing them. They were solid steel, impossible to break with bare hands. But Serena didn't need brute strength. She needed leverage. She scanned the dark duct and found a discarded metal pipe left by a construction crew years ago. She jammed the pipe between the grid frame and the concrete wall, aiming for the corner where the mounting bolts were almost eaten away by rust. Using the pipe as a lever, she pushed with her entire body weight. The corroded metal began to groan under the pressure. She didn't stop. With a final, muscle-tearing heave, the rusted bolts snapped, and the metal frame screeched and popped loose from the concrete, creating a gap just wide enough for an adult and a child to pass. Her hands were bleeding and torn, but there was no time for pain. She turned to Theo and told him to go. He saw the blood and stared in fear. She smiled and said it was just a scratch, and she had been hurt worse before, and not to worry. She crawled through first, then pulled Theo through, shielding his small body from the sharp metal. They continued, now in the main duct sloping down. Serena used her hands and feet to control their slide and keep Theo from falling too fast. The blood on her hands made the metal slick, but she kept control. Finally, they reached the intake vent for the safe room. It was heavily sealed with pressure clamps and a rubber gasket to prevent gas attacks. Impossible to simply unscrew. But Serena saw the rubber gasket was old and dry-rotted, a maintenance oversight Marcus had missed. She jammed her folding knife into the compromised seal, using every ounce of her remaining strength to pry the heavy grill frame away from the wall until the rusted clamps gave way with a metallic screech. The grill opened. She saw the safe room below. She dropped down first, landing silently though her knees wanted to give way. She reached up for Theo and set him down safely. The safe room was a square chamber with 1-meter-thick concrete walls, a bomb-proof steel door, and its own air filtration system, built by Marcus to protect his family. Tonight it would save his son. Serena led Theo inside and closed the heavy door. She turned the locking wheel and heard the bolts slide home. No one could open it from outside without the code or heavy explosives. She turned to Theo. He stood trembling in the middle of the room, no longer crying but still frightened. She wrapped him in her arms and whispered that they were safe now. Theo clung to her and finally cried aloud, not in terror but in the release of a child freed from a nightmare. Serena held him and let him cry, while her eyes searched the room for anything that could help them reach the outside world. While Serena and Theo were hiding in the basement safe room, Marcus Blackwood was facing the greatest betrayal of his life on the first floor. With Victor still pressing the gun to the back of his head, the cold metal barrel tight against his skull, and the partners from Chicago and Miami held at gunpoint by Victor's men in the corner of the room, with their hands raised and faces pale, because they had come to sign a business deal and not to die. And Marcus stood still, with his body rigid, but his mind racing, because he had heard the gunshot from the third floor and knew his son was in danger. And now the man he had trusted for 15 years was pointing a gun at him, and Victor ordered him to kneel with his voice, stripped of all pretense. And Marcus knelt slowly with his hands behind his head and his eyes still forward. And he didn't beg and he didn't ask why, and he only waited and searched for an opening. And Victor stepped around to stand in front of him with the gun aimed at his forehead, because he wanted to see his enemy's face. When he revealed the truth and he asked if Marcus knew why, and said that for 15 years he had stood beside him and smiled and called him brother and thought about this moment every day. And Marcus looked at him and saw for the first time the depth of hatred in his eyes, a hatred hidden for more than a decade. And Victor reminded him of the warehouse at the port 10 years earlier and the order Marcus had given to wipe out smugglers. And Marcus remembered because it had been one of his first cleanups as leader, fast and ruthless with no witnesses. And Victor screamed that his brother had been in there. Daniel, 23 years old, just a night shift worker who didn't even know whose warehouse it was. And Marcus closed his eyes for a second because he hadn't known and had never even heard of Daniel Crane. And to him, it had only been another business killing. But to Victor, it had been the day his world collapsed. And Marcus said he was sorry and that he hadn't known. And Victor laughed bitterly and said, sorry wouldn't bring his brother back or erase 10 years of swallowing his grief every time. Marcus called him brother, and he leaned close and hissed that tonight Marcus would pay, and that first he would kill Marcus's son in front of him so Marcus would know what it felt like to lose the one he loved most, and then he would force Marcus to sign everything over, and finally he would put a bullet in his head. And Marcus's eyes flared with rage, and he told Victor not to touch Theo. And Victor smiled and said it was too late, and his men were bringing the boy down now. And Marcus would watch his son die just like Victor had watched his brother's body in the morgue. And at that moment Victor's radio crackled with a panicked voice saying there was a problem and Kane was down and the whole third-floor team was down and the boy was gone. And Victor froze and demanded to know what that meant. And the voice said someone had attacked them, and Kane was unconscious and 2 were dead and the boy wasn't there. And Victor stared at Marcus and demanded what he had done and whether he had someone in the building. And Marcus was just as shocked but hid it better because he didn't know who had saved Theo, but he knew his son might still be alive. And Victor was distracted, and this was the only chance. And Marcus moved fast and lunged aside as Victor turned the gun, and the bullet tore past his shoulder, ripping his jacket but not his skin. And Marcus rolled and kicked a gun from one of Victor's men, and grabbed it, and shot the other in the tension leg and turned the gun on Victor, and they exchanged fire. Across the room, with glass shattering and bullets thudding into walls, while Anthony Russo and Diego Fernandez lay flat on the floor covering their heads. And Marcus took a hit in his left arm, but the pain only fueled him, and he fired back and hit Victor in the shoulder, and Victor fell and his gun flew away. And Marcus stepped on Victor's chest and aimed the gun at his head, and Victor coughed blood and laughed, and said Marcus still wouldn't find his son, and that his men were still in the building, and the boy would die before Marcus found and him. And Marcus tightened his grip and his finger shook on the trigger because every part of him wanted to kill Victor, but if he did, he wouldn't know how many enemies were left or where Theo was, and he needed Victor alive, at least until he disgrip, found his son. And Marcus stepped forward, his eyes burning with cold rage, ready to pull the trigger and end it. But Victor, coughing blood yet smiling through stained teeth, rasped, "Kill me, and you'll never find the boy. My men have him moving." Marcus hesitated, the seconds ticking away like hammer blows. He couldn't risk it. He kicked Victor's weapon across the room, leaving the traitor gasping on the floor, and turned to run, prioritizing his son over revenge. He didn't see Victor drag himself toward a discarded radio the moment he left the room with blood dripping from his arm across the marble floor, because he had to find Theo no matter the cost, and he didn't know who had saved his son. But if Theo was alive, he would owe that person his life. The safe room was designed to be self-sufficient for at least 72 hours, with bottled water, dry food, a medical first aid kit, flashlights, and most importantly, an emergency phone connected to a separate line that didn't run through the mansion's switchboard. And Serena found the phone inside a wall cabinet, a simple device with a numeric keypad and a satellite connection, and she picked it up and heard the steady signal tone, and knew the line was still working. and she dialed a number she had memorized for 4 years even though she had never called it. The number of Derek Shaw, her former SAC unit commander. The man who had tried to protect her when the CIA froze everything. The only person in the system she still trusted. And after 3 rings, a deep male voice answered and said this was Derek Shaw. And Serena took a breath and said, "Derek, it's Serena. Serena Cole." And there was silence on the other end for a few seconds. And then Derek's voice changed from professional to stunned. And he said, "Cole, Serena Cole, you're alive." And Serena ignored the question and spoke urgently, saying she needed immediate support and that this was Blackwood Manor on the West Hill of the city. And there were at least 5 armed intruders and a hostage situation, and she was in the basement safe room with a 6-year-old child and needed SWAT. Right now. And Derek didn't ask more because after 4 years of silence, and after everything that had happened, his best operative was calling for help, and that meant it was serious. And he said he had the coordinates and would deploy SWAT within 15 minutes, and told her to hold position, and asked if she was armed. And Serena reached for her back pocket, only to grasp empty air, realizing the weapon must have slipped out in the vents, and she took a sharp breath and replied that she was unarmed, and that her hand was injured but functional, and that the child was Theo Blackwood, Marcus Blackwood's son. And Derek paused for a second, because he knew exactly who Marcus Blackwood was, and what kind of building that was, and that this was complicated, and he asked if she was sure she wanted them to intervene. And Serena answered firmly that there was a 6-year-old child there, and she didn't care who his father was, and only cared about getting him out alive. And Derek said understood, and that SWAT was on the way, and to stay in contact if possible. And he added after a brief pause that it was good to hear her voice. And Serena ended the call because there was no time for pleasantries, and she turned back to Theo, who was curled on the couch in the corner with his knees to his chest, watching her, and she sat beside him and told him gently that help was coming and they just had to wait a little longer. And Theo asked if his father was okay, and Serena reassured him that his father was strong and would be fine, even though she didn't know Marcus's condition. And Theo asked who she was because she was just the cleaner and why she could fight like that. And Serena looked into his wide brown eyes full of confusion and curiosity, and told him slowly that she used to have a different job before coming there. A job where she had to protect people in danger. And Theo asked if she was like a superhero, and she smiled and said not really, just an ordinary person who had been taught how to help others. And he asked why she stopped, and Serena thought of Lily and said because she had a daughter and wanted to be with her more. And Theo asked if she had a daughter, and she said yes, her name was Lily and she was 6, just like him. And Theo's eyes brightened for the first time that night, and he asked what Lily liked, and Serena told him she liked drawing butterflies and flowers, and loved strawberry ice cream. And every weekend they went to the park and sat on the swings and counted clouds. And Theo said he liked drawing cars and airplanes, and that his mother used to sit and watch him draw, and his voice fell when he mentioned her. And Serena squeezed his hand, and told him his mother would be very proud of him, and that when Serena was afraid she thought about Lily and about getting home to her, and that it made her brave. And Theo asked in surprise if she was afraid too, and said she was so strong, and she said everyone was afraid, but brave people did the right thing, even when they were afraid, just like he had done tonight. And Theo looked at her, and his eyes filled with tears again, but not from fear this time, and he said he wanted to see his father. And Serena held him and promised he would soon, and they sat together in silence, a stranger and a child who had just met but were bound by one night of hell, and a simple trust between human beings. And outside the sound of helicopters began to echo in the night, and help was on the way. Marcus ran down to the basement like a madman, blood from the wound on his arm dripping along the steps, and he didn't care about the pain, and he didn't care about Victor lying unconscious upstairs, and he didn't care that there might still be intruders in the house, because only one thing filled his mind: Theo, his son, the only child he had left in this world, and a father's instinct led him to the safe room, the place he had built to protect his family in emergencies, and the place he had taught Theo to run to if anything ever happened. And if someone had saved his son, and that person was smart, they would have brought Theo here. And he stood before the half-meter thick steel door with his heart pounding in his chest, because if the room was empty, he didn't know what he would do, and he didn't know if he could survive losing another loved one. And Marcus pounded on the door, and his voice echoed through the basement corridor as he shouted Theo and asked if his son was inside. And inside the safe room, Serena and Theo both startled. And Serena jumped up with the knife in her hand and pulled Theo behind her because she didn't know who was outside, and it could have been Victor's people. But then she heard the voice calling Theo and saying he was his father and to open the door, and Theo's eyes lit up, and he cried that it was his father, and ran for the door, but Serena caught his hand and told him to wait so she could check first. And she pressed her ear to the cold steel, and listened, and heard only one set of footsteps, and heavy breathing, and no voices or signals of others, and she called through the door asking if he was alone, and Marcus answered in shock and hope, asking who was inside and if Theo was safe. And Theo cried out that he was there and that he was safe, and that was all the confirmation Serena needed. And she turned the locking wheel and heard the bolt slide, and the heavy door opened, and Marcus stood in the doorway pale with his jacket torn and his left hand bloody. But when he saw Theo, behind Serena nothing else mattered, and he rushed in and knelt, and wrapped his son in his arms, holding him as if he would vanish if he let go. And Theo cried that he had been scared, and bad men had taken him, but the woman had saved him and brought him here, and Marcus held him shaking. And for the first time since Isabella died in his arms on the blood-stained sidewalk, Marcus Blackwood cried, tears streaming down the face of the most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast, a man who had killed without flinching and stared into hell without blinking. But now he wasn't a boss. He was just a father who had almost lost his child, and he whispered apologies into Theo's hair. And Serena stepped back and leaned against the wall and watched, and saw herself in that moment, the night she had found Lily in the abandoned warehouse, and held her and cried like she never had before. And she understood that a parent's love crossed every boundary, and that in this moment Marcus was only a father. And Marcus looked up, and for the first time truly saw the woman who had saved his son, the torn black shirt and dust-covered work pants, the bleeding hands, the calm face and knife-sharp eyes, a woman he hadn't noticed once in 8 months, and he asked who she was. And before Serena could answer, the sound of gunshots and shouting echoed from above because Victor had woken up and he was coming. Victor Crane appeared at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement. Blood was still seeping from the wound in his shoulder. His face was twisted with pain and hatred. Behind him were the last 2 gunmen, the operator from the control room, and a straggler from the second floor whom Victor had now gathered for a final attempt. 3 gun barrels were pointed straight at the open door of the safe room where Marcus was holding Theo. Victor screamed that no one was to move, that Marcus thought he had won, and that Victor would end this now, and would shoot the boy in front of him, just like his brother had died because of Marcus. Marcus slowly stood and pushed Theo behind him, using his own body as a shield. He had no weapon, only his bare hands and his resolve to protect his son. He told Victor to kill him if he wanted, but to let the boy go, because he was only 6 and had done nothing wrong. Victor laughed wildly and shouted that his brother had done nothing wrong either, that Daniel had only been 23 and working nights to pay tuition, and Marcus had killed him, and now it was Marcus's turn to feel that pain. Victor raised his gun and aimed at Theo's trembling form. Marcus closed his eyes, ready to take the bullet himself if needed. Inside the safe room, Serena instinctively reached for the pistol in her back pocket, but stopped mid-motion. The memory of a metallic clatter in the ventilation shaft flashed in her mind. The gun was gone, left behind in the desperate slide down. She was unarmed. She had no choice left. Now, there was no choice left. She couldn't shoot. She could only shield. At that moment, Serena stepped forward from the safe room and stood between Victor and the Blackwoods, her arms spread wide, her eyes fixed on Victor without fear. Victor hesitated. He recognized her face and the work pants and realized she was the cleaner. He mocked her and sneered at Marcus for trusting his son to a cleaning woman. Serena didn't speak. She only stood there, calm as stone, while calculating distance and angles and positions. 3 targets. Victor in the center, about 5 meters away. The 2 others, 2 meters apart. Victor shouted for her to move or he would shoot her first. Serena answered coldly to go ahead if he dared. Victor froze at her calm. Then anger surged, and he began to pull the trigger. At that exact moment, glass shattered upstairs. Automatic gunfire echoed. A loudspeaker shouted, "FBI, drop your weapons." SWAT had arrived. Victor turned for a split second. That was all Serena needed. She lunged forward and knocked his gun aside as he fired. The bullet grazed her shoulder and buried itself in the wall. She struck his throat and he collapsed. She disarmed and incapacitated the 2 gunmen in rapid movements. In 3 seconds, all 3 lay unmoving on the floor. Serena stood breathing hard. Marcus and Theo stared in shock. Marcus had never seen anyone move that fast, that precisely, that deadly, and it had been the cleaner in his house for 8 months. SWAT flooded the basement and restrained Victor and his men and aimed weapons at Marcus and at Serena, until Derek Shaw stepped forward and ordered them to lower their guns. He walked to Serena, and after looking at her raised his hand and saluted her like a general, leaving everyone, including Marcus Blackwood, completely stunned. Derek Shaw's salute dropped the basement into absolute silence. The SWAT officers looked at one another in confusion, unable to understand why their commander was standing at attention for a woman in bloodied, dusty work clothes with bleeding hands standing among 3 fallen gunmen. Marcus Blackwood stood frozen as well, with Theo clinging to his leg and staring in wide brown-eyed confusion. Derek lowered his hand, but his gaze stayed fixed on Serena with undisguised respect as he addressed her as Captain Cole and said it was an honor to see her again. Serena nodded slightly and said nothing. She lowered her hands and looked around the basement, now filled with flashlights and rifles and radio chatter. Her part was done. It was time for others to take over, but the SWAT team still didn't understand. Some of them kept their weapons trained on Marcus, recognizing him as the Mafia boss the FBI had tracked for years. One shouted for Marcus Blackwood to raise his hands and declared him under arrest. Marcus didn't resist, but he didn't comply either. He stood still, holding Theo, staring down the barrels. He was ready to die to protect his son. He wouldn't let anyone take Theo from him after this night. Serena saw the tension rising and stepped forward again between SWAT and Marcus, with her arms spread, shielding them both, just as she had done with Victor, and now with the FBI. A SWAT officer yelled at her to move or be arrested for obstruction. Serena didn't move. She looked him in the eye and said calmly and with authority, "We are the victims." The words landed like an order. Derek stepped in and raised his voice, cutting through the chaos. "Stand down," he ordered. He looked at his team with a stern gaze. "Priority 1 tonight is the kidnapping and the hostile paramilitary unit. We don't have an active federal warrant for Blackwood on us right now, so let's not complicate the paperwork. Secure the hostiles first. We will sort out the rest later." He then turned to the officer and declared that Marcus Blackwood and his son were the victims of a kidnapping, and that this woman had rescued them and that she had more authority than anyone in the room to say so. The officers slowly lowered their guns, though still confused. Marcus looked from Derek to Serena and asked who she was, because she had worked in his house for 8 months cleaning his floors, and yet had just taken down 3 gunmen in 3 seconds. Derek looked to Serena for permission, but she gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Derek understood instantly, and turned to Marcus and the officers with absolute authority, stating that she was a deep cover operative under the highest level of federal protection, and that her file was sealed and classified. He declared that she had served her country in places that didn't exist on maps and possessed a service record that commanded respect from anyone in uniform, adding that that was all they were cleared to know. Marcus stared at Serena, trying to see the warrior Derek described in the small woman before him, and asked why she was cleaning his floors. Derek paused and said it was her story to tell, but that she had sacrificed a great deal for her country, and her country hadn't treated her well. He then leaned in closer to Serena, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "And Cole? The file on the leak in Syria has been reopened. We found the mole. We're coming for him." Serena stepped closer to Marcus and looked him in the eye. She said she hadn't saved his son because of who Marcus was, but because the boy was 6 and in danger. She said she would do the same for any child, whether their father was a president or a criminal. Marcus was left speechless as his view of the world began to fracture. Theo said softly that Serena was very brave and had carried him through the vents while her hands were bleeding, and she told him to be brave like Lily. Marcus asked who Lily was. Serena smiled gently and said she was her daughter, also 6, waiting for her at home. In that moment, Marcus finally saw Serena, not as a cleaner or an operative, but as a mother, just as she had seen him as a father. 2 people from different worlds bound by love for their children. The FBI teams worked through the night to secure the scene and collect evidence. Blackwood Manor became a maze of floodlights, yellow tape, and forensic technicians in white suits. Victor Crane was carried out of the basement on a stretcher with his hands cuffed and blood still seeping from the shoulder wound Marcus had given him earlier. When he passed Marcus standing with Theo in his arms, Victor stopped. He clutched his swollen throat, gasping for air through the injury Serena had inflicted. He stared at his enemy of 15 years with bloodshot eyes and rasped, his voice a broken, painful wheeze, that Marcus might think he had won tonight, but he would never be safe, because there would always be someone else, and one day one of them would succeed. Marcus met his gaze without blinking, his face cold as stone, and said nothing, because Victor had lost, and his curses were only the cries of a defeated man. The agents dragged Victor away and pushed him into a waiting police car, and it was the last time Marcus would see the man he had once called brother. On the 3rd floor, Kane Mitchell was found still unconscious in Theo's bedroom with a broken wrist and a knife wound in his shoulder. He was cuffed and carried out on a stretcher along with the 2 men Serena had taken down. The other members of the infiltration team were found scattered throughout the building, some unconscious and some dead from firefights with SWAT while trying to escape. Anthony Russo and Diego Fernandez were discovered unharmed in the conference room and were immediately detained by federal agents for interrogation. Ingrid Vale was arrested while trying to drive off the property with her car full of suitcases and $200,000 in cash. She cried and begged and said Victor had forced her and that she hadn't known the plan included killing. But the evidence didn't lie. The messages on her phone, the money transfers, and the sleeping pills left in her room all stood against her. Ingrid Vale would face charges nearly as serious as Victor's. The FBI collected everything that could be used as evidence. Victor's encrypted phone was found in his office, full of messages and calls with Kane Mitchell and contacts linked to the Moretti family. Financial records showed Victor had been moving money overseas for 3 years, preparing for betrayal. The asset transfer contract he meant to force Marcus to sign was found in his briefcase, proving it was not only a kidnapping but an organized attempt to seize control. The tampered security system was restored, showing the entire team entering the building. The replaced emergency exit lock was removed as evidence. Derek Shaw personally oversaw the process, because he knew the case was complex, involving a mafia boss, a former CIA operative, and an interstate criminal network, and everything had to be done perfectly, with no gaps for lawyers later. As dawn broke on the horizon, Victor Crane, Ingrid Vale, Kane Mitchell, and 5 surviving accomplices were transferred to federal custody to face 17 charges, including kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy to seize assets, armed assault, and more. The long night of horror was over. But for Marcus Blackwood and Serena Cole, the story was only just beginning. When the last police cars left the grounds and the FBI teams began packing up the scene, Marcus found Serena sitting alone on the back steps of the manor. A medic had already bandaged her hand. White gauze wrapped around her palm, now stained with faint red. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, washing the sky in pale orange, but her eyes were distant, as if she wasn't really seeing it. Theo had been taken inside by a nurse and had finally fallen asleep after the night of terror, and now Marcus had time to speak to the woman who had saved his son's life. He walked over and sat beside her without speaking for a long while, the two of them sitting in silence watching the sun rise over the distant hills. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice low and tired, and said he didn't know how to thank her. Serena didn't turn her head and said he didn't need to, that she had only done what she had to do. Marcus watched her profile in the morning light and thought she was strangely beautiful, not in the polished way of the women in his world, but in the way of strength, of unseen scars, of someone who had walked through hell and still kept her humanity. He said Derek Shaw told him she had been a CIA operative with more than 30 hostage rescues, and asked why she had left that life to scrub his floors. Serena was quiet for a long time, as if weighing whether to answer. Then she sighed and began to speak in a distant, steady voice, and said that 4 years earlier she had had a family, that her husband Nathan was also an operative, and that they had a daughter named Lily who was 2 at the time, that they had gone on a mission together in Syria to rescue a kidnapped diplomat, that Nathan had been betrayed by a mole inside the CIA, and they had been ambushed, that he had died in her arms in the desert with his blood soaking into the sand, and his last words had been to tell her to protect Lily. Marcus felt frozen because he knew that pain, because he had held Isabella on a blood-soaked sidewalk and heard her ask him to protect Theo, and he understood that loss more than most people ever could. Serena continued and said she had gone home, but the traitor had kidnapped Lily to silence her, that her 3-year-old daughter had been taken because of secrets she knew, that she had found her after 48 hours without sleep in an abandoned warehouse, guarded by 4 men whom she had killed with her bare hands, that when she ran out holding Lily, her daughter hadn't cried but had only clung to her neck and said she was scared. Her voice broke for a moment, and she took a breath before saying the CIA hadn't rewarded her but had frozen everything because she knew too much and knew the traitor's identity, that they had taken her apartment, her accounts, her identity, and she had become nobody, a ghost with a child and bloody memories. Marcus felt anger burn in his chest because she had sacrificed everything for her country, and her country had done this to her. Serena went on and said her mother had cancer, and she had worked 3 jobs to pay for medicine and raise Lily, serving coffee by day, doing laundry on weekends, and cleaning floors at night, and that she hadn't cared who Marcus was or what he did. She had only needed her wages on time. Marcus lowered his head, ashamed of the luxury he lived in while she struggled, ashamed that he hadn't truly seen her once in 8 months, and he told her he wanted to repay her with anything she wanted: money, a home, a better job, medical care for her mother, the best schools for her daughter. Serena finally turned to him, her eyes calm and without greed, and said she hadn't saved his son for money. When he asked why, she said slowly that it was because his son was 6, like her daughter. Because when she saw Theo, she saw Lily. Because no child should suffer for the sins of adults. And she stood up, brushed off her pants, and said she didn't care whether he was a mafia boss or a president, that every child deserved to live and to have a father, that she had lost her husband and her daughter had lost her father, and she didn't want another child to go through that if she could stop it. Marcus looked at her and whispered that his wife Isabella had always said children were innocent and shouldn't pay for their parents' sins. Serena nodded and said Isabella must have been a good woman, then said she had to go home because her daughter was waiting. Marcus stood and asked to at least drive her because she hadn't slept and her hand was injured. And Serena paused, looked back, and said all right, but only because she wanted to see her daughter sooner, not because he owed her anything. And then they left Blackwood Manor together in the pale morning light. Two strangers from different worlds bound by one night of hell and by love for their children. 3 weeks after the night of horror at Blackwood Manor, Victor Crane and Ingrid Vale were formally charged with 17 counts, including kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy to seize assets, and multiple other serious crimes. Kane Mitchell and his accomplices took plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences and testimony against Victor and his ties to the Moretti family. The case became major news across the media, though Serena Cole's name was never mentioned, because Derek Shaw ensured her identity remained protected, and she was recorded only as an anonymous witness who had assisted law enforcement. Around that same time, something strange happened when Serena went to the hospital to pay her mother's medical bills as she did every week, and was told that all expenses had already been paid. Not only that month's medication, but the full cost of treatment until Mrs. Cole recovered completely, including her transfer to a better hospital with top specialists. When Serena asked who had paid, the staff said it was an anonymous donor. Serena knew without being told that it was Marcus Blackwood. Although she had refused his help, he had found his own way to repay her, leaving her unsure whether to feel angry or grateful, and finally choosing silence for her mother, for Lily, and because sometimes pride has to step aside for love. 3 months later, Serena Cole's life had changed completely. She no longer worked as a cleaner or cafe server. She had opened a small coffee shop in the suburbs with her savings and a discreet loan she suspected also came from Marcus. The shop was called Lily's Corner, a warm place with butterfly and flower drawings on the walls, all painted by her daughter. Her mother was now much healthier and able to sit reading in the corner each afternoon. Lily, the 6-year-old with eyes like her mother's, finally had a friend. One autumn afternoon, when yellow leaves drifted past the windows, the doorbell chimed, and Serena looked up to see Marcus Blackwood enter holding Theo's hand. The boy was different now. His big brown eyes lit up when he saw Lily drawing in the corner. "Lily," he called as he let go of his father and ran to her. The children hugged, then sat to draw together, their soft laughter filling the room. Marcus stepped to the counter and smiled gently. He asked if she could make him a coffee. Serena nodded and prepared it with practiced movements. Marcus sat and looked around, saying the place was beautiful and she had built a good life. Serena placed the cup before him and said he had paid her mother's hospital bills and the loan for the cafe. Marcus didn't deny it. He said he had told her he wanted to repay her and that she had refused, but he hadn't listened. Serena watched him a moment and sighed, then said thank you. Marcus smiled in a way that finally reached his eyes and said wasn't he the one who should thank her. They fell quiet, watching the children as Lily taught Theo to draw a butterfly, and Theo tried clumsily but earnestly. Their laughter was the most beautiful sound either of them had heard in a long time. Marcus said she had taught him a lesson. Serena asked what lesson. Marcus said the most important people in life are often the ones we don't see. He said he had spent his life judging people by power and money, thinking only the rich and powerful mattered, while people like her, cleaners, servers, those in unseen jobs, were treated as if they didn't exist. He said that the night everything collapsed, it wasn't elite guards or million-dollar security systems that saved his son, but a woman he had never truly looked at, who had cleaned his floors for 8 months without him knowing her name. Serena smiled softly and said he wasn't the only one who had learned something. She said she had learned sometimes those we think are enemies are just parents trying to protect their children like we are. Marcus nodded and asked if 2 enemies could become friends. Serena looked at Lily and Theo playing and said she thought their children had already decided that. Marcus watched Theo hold Lily's hand as they ran outside chasing golden leaves. He left money far more than the coffee cost on the counter and said if she ever needed anything to call him. Serena nodded and told him the same. Marcus corrected her to call him Marcus. Serena repeated his name. Marcus left with a smile still on his face. He looked back once at the small cafe and the woman behind the counter, who had changed the way he saw the world. The invisible hero. The story ends as a story about forgotten people, silent heroes, and great hearts hidden behind ordinary lives. It reminds us never to underestimate those around us, because sometimes the most important person in your life is the one you've never noticed. Whether a cleaner, a guard, or a server, each with their own story and unseen sacrifices. It invites us to share our thoughts and our own silent heroes, to like, share, subscribe, and remember that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we never see. Goodbye, and see you in the next story.